Thank you for joining us for another exciting Artful conversation. My name is Oliver Tostmann. I am the Susan Morse Hillis Curator of European Art at the Wadsworth Atheneum. And tonight, we will be listening to Dr. Britany Salsbury. She is discussing Picasso and Paper, a current exhibition at the Cleveland Museum of Art. We lent to this wonderful show Picasso's Women of Algiers, a painting that came to us only in 1994. As many of you already know, our relationship with Picasso started as early as 1934, when the Wadsworth hosted the first Picasso exhibition in this country. Currently, you can also see a rarely exhibited pencil drawing by the artist in our drawings exhibition, Paper Color Line European Master Drawings. Cleveland has one of the most impressive art collections in the country. Some of you may remember that the museum generously lent La Vie, Picasso's masterwork from the Blue Period, about 10 years to us. Cleveland's Picasso and Paper explores Picasso's use of paper in drawings, cutouts, collage, and prints. It has been developed together with the Royal Academy in London and was recently praised by the Wall Street Journal as the, I quote, best kept secret in the current art season. And we all have a chance to see this terrific show until March 23rd. The show's mastermind, Dr. Britany Salsbury, is the curator of prints and drawings at the Cleveland Museum of Art. A specialist of works on paper, Britany gained her PhD in 2015 at the City University of New York. She then went to the Department of Prints and Drawings at RISD in Providence, Rhode Island, only to become associate curator of prints and drawings at the Milwaukee Art Museum in 2017. Britany started in Cleveland as associate curator in 2018 and became full curator in 2023. During her career, she has taught at various universities and has also become a regular contributor of the journal Print Quarterly. Before passing the word to our speaker, I would like to encourage you to type in any question you may have for Britany. We will have a Q&A session after her talk. And now I'm excited to pass over to Britany. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for that very kind introduction. And thank you also for the fantastic loan of the Wadsworth Atheneum's painting Women of Algiers by Picasso to Picasso and Paper. And I'm so glad that that loan, which contributed so greatly to our exhibition, also gave us the occasion for this talk and me to be able to speak to your group this evening. And as Oliver mentioned, I spent some time in New York and also in Providence, Rhode Island. So not too far away from Hartford. And I have very fond memories of visiting the museum several times and being just awestruck by your amazing collection. So I'm very glad to be here tonight. I would love to encourage any and all of you who are interested to make the trip to Cleveland. As we get into March, it will be slightly more pleasant to visit Cleveland. We've had a very snowy winter, but you do have over a month still to come and see the exhibition while it's on view. And so tonight I'll be taking you on a deeper dive of Picasso and Paper. And the show opened in early December and will be on view through March 23rd. And to begin with a bit of backstory, Picasso and Paper was organized by the Cleveland Museum of Art in collaboration with the Royal Academy of Art in London, with the support of the Musée National Picasso-Paris. And it was on view in London, which you're seeing here in just a few installation views for just over a month in really unfortuitously timed in early 2020, before museums worldwide closed due to COVID. And as the pandemic dragged on, the show was postponed indefinitely in Cleveland and was then finally rescheduled for this year. So it's a show that has been in the making for even longer than usual for us, and in this case, for nearly a decade. And here you're seeing just a few images of what the show looks like in our exhibition. Again, in hopes of enticing you to come make a visit. And this is the intro to our first gallery with a wonderful early self-portrait from Picasso's Blue Period. The exhibition is very substantial with nearly 300 objects total. And at the CMA, it actually occupies both of our special exhibitions galleries, which usually have two separate shows. So it's very large. One more installation view as the show appears now. So today I'll give you an overview of the exhibition and of its topic. It considers Picasso's engagement with paper and the ways in which this particular material was at the center of some of his greatest and most innovative experimentation. So the exhibition is organized chronologically, which I think is really wonderful because it allows us to trace Picasso's longstanding fascination with virtually all types of paper. So everything from artist materials to ephemera throughout the course of his entire career. And I want to start out by giving just a quick introduction to the Picasso Museum, which again was our partner for the show, and which is where we have many exceptional loans in the exhibition from. The vast majority of the works in the show are from the Picasso Museum. Some of you may have visited it. It opened in 1974, the year after Picasso's death, to house a collection of about 5,000 artworks from his studio and from his personal collection. And so these included artworks, but also Picasso's personal archives. So things like his photographs, his correspondence, everything that he had, basically. Picasso left no will upon his death, and so his estate tax to the French state was paid in the form of these works. And so it is the largest collection in the world of his art. Picasso and Paper draws from these holdings, as well as other important collections around the world, including your own. You can see your painting prominently displayed here. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, and many others, to shed new light on Picasso's use of paper. A friend early on described him as, quote, lost in a mountain of papers, and Picasso used the material for a variety of types of art making. These included traditional uses, things like drawing, printmaking, and photography, but also experimental collages and sculptures. And here you're seeing him in his studio with some of these works in progress. And here you're seeing him in a self-portrait included in the exhibition from 1918. He is an artist who has plenty of name recognition, but I still think that it is worth taking the time for a quick overview of his life and the reasons why he holds such an important place within the canon of art history. He was a Spanish artist who spent much of his life in France and is credited with changing the course of modern art through his invention of Cubism. And this is an example of his Cubist work from the exhibition. Cubism is considered one of the most transformative movements within the 20th century because it dispensed with the idea that an artist's job it was to try to realistically represent something and opened the door for artists to experiment with abstraction over the decades that followed. Picasso and his collaborator Georges Braque actively worked to question the ideas about vision and perception that had governed art making for generations. And we'll get into that a bit more in just a moment. Picasso and Paper tracks this evolution in Picasso's work through his interest in paper. And as the exhibition reveals, despite the fact that he went on to become a hero of the avant-garde, Picasso actually started out with traditional training, which will play an important part throughout his entire career. His father worked in the arts as a drawing instructor and curator, and so he had the benefit of someone who recognized his talent early on and supported him. Often repeated within Picasso lore is a story about how he could not only could he draw before he could speak, but that when he did speak, his first word was pencil in Spanish. In one of the very earliest drawings from the exhibition, we see him sketching from a plaster cast as a 12-year-old. And this was an advanced exercise undertaken by art students, which he was already doing at a very, very young age. And we can clearly see the skill that he has already learned in rendering highlights and shadows. Picasso's career took off after he made his first trip to Paris in 1900, after having a painting accepted at that year's Universal Exposition. This show was an international exhibition featuring the greatest artistic accomplishments by each country, and so it was a tremendous achievement for him at a very young age. Picasso took several trips to Paris in the ensuing years and fully settled there in 1904. At the time, he lived in deep poverty in Montmartre, a neighborhood populated by artists and models. In this photo from the time, he stands in front of his longtime studio located in a building called the Bateau Lavoir. While there, he worked prolifically, learned to speak French, and tried to establish his own professional reputation. In 1903, Picasso had begun his blue period, and this is where Picasso and Paper begins to really actively trace his work. This CMA's painting La Vie, which is one of the reasons why any great enthusiast of Picasso's work is familiar with Cleveland, is one of his best known works from the time. The painting was made during a trip back to Spain, specifically to Barcelona, and shows a nude couple confronting a mother and child. The vague narrative is set in an artist's studio with two paintings. And the young man in the couple clearly resembles Picasso's friend Carlos Casagemas, who had recently and tragically died by suicide. He embraces a girlfriend who had recently spurned him, leading to a period of depression and ultimately to his death. And X-rays carried out here at the CMA by our conservation team have shown that Picasso actually painted the composition over the painting that he had shown at the 1900 Universal Exhibition, so during his first trip to Paris. And here you're seeing that image, the back of the painting, while it's being X-rayed. You can see just very faintly the original painting through the canvas, and then you're seeing the extant sketches for the original painting. Picasso and Paper reveals the important part that paper, and specifically drawing, played in developing the composition. In the galleries, the painting appears alongside several related drawings, allowing visitors to see Picasso's working process and how he repeatedly considered the image. Initial studies make it clear that the setting was an artist's studio and show the evolution of the figures. The one at right was originally an old man, but that idea was abandoned. And the young man was originally a self-portrait of the artist rather than a portrait of his friend Casagemas. And so this all reveals that Picasso considered virtually every possible permutation of the composition before ever putting brush to canvas, putting paper at the center of his creative process. Breaking from the blue tones that dominated his work, Picasso also made his first prints during this early period, initiating a lifelong interest. He worked in intaglio, which is a printmaking that includes techniques like etching and engraving and involves carving in some way into a copper plate, which is then inked and run through a press. And he focused on similar subjects to his paintings. Here we see his very first etching, the frugal meal. A couple with exaggeratedly long, thin limbs shares a spare meal of bread and wine. And what I love about this print is that to create it, Picasso actually reused, because again, he's like a poor, struggling artist. And so he recycled a printing plate that had already been used by one of his friends. So if you look very closely at the upper right corner of the work, you can still see traces of the previous landscape that his friend had drawn onto the plate and that Picasso hadn't completely been able to obscure before he created his own image on it. And his friend is someone who has is completely lost to art history today, but has this kind of afterlife for his work through this background of the Picasso print. Picasso drew with an etching needle, but then also would go back in and scrape the plate, scrape highlights into the plate on the man and woman. So he was effectively working forward and backward tonally with the image. The print also saw Picasso beginning another trend that would last his entire career, which was collaboration. Anyone who has ever made a print knows that it almost always includes some degree of teamwork. To create the frugal meal, for example, Picasso created the printing plate and then turned it over to the man who you see here, Eugène Delacroix. Delacroix was one of the most renowned master printers in Paris at the time. He had worked with many of the Impressionists and with other important avant-garde artists around the turn of the century. And he would have worked with Picasso throughout the entire process of inking and printing to make sure that his design was translated to the page in exactly the way that Picasso wanted. Picasso and Delacroix worked together often throughout the Blue period, and Picasso went on to seek out similar collaborative relationships with other master printers in the years that followed. Picasso's artistic style often changed alongside major life events, and in 1904 he entered his Rose period. This coincided with his new relationship with Fernande Olivier, who you are seeing in this watercolor. She was an artist and a model with whom he had a tumultuous relationship until 1912. Picasso's art at this time was defined by mostly pink tones, partly because the rosier tone of his life at this time, he's in a new relationship, but also partly due to travels that he undertook with Olivier to the town of Gozel on the French and Spanish border. There, Picasso was drawn to the ochre, brown, and pink tonality of the architecture and landscape, and it came to play a prominent part in his work. In Picasso's drawings of Fernande from this time, we can start to see the very beginnings of Cubism, such as here the abstracted oval of her head, formed by a headscarf. It's also worth noting that the Rose period is a particular strength of the Cleveland Museum of Art's collection. And so in this exhibition, we've been especially excited to be able to feature some really great highlights from our prints and drawings and our paintings collection in this space. The Rose period lasted about 2 years through 1906 and led Picasso to his earliest experiments in Cubism. Late that year, he began one of his best-known works, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The painting presents 5 nude women, clearly identifiable to viewers in his time as sex workers, posed before a drapery and gazing directly at the viewer. The angular geometric forms that Picasso used to depict the women were completely new at the time in the way that they fragmented identifiable subject matter. Like much of his work at this time, the painting's style directly referenced the visual culture of non-Western people. In particular, Picasso viewed, studied, and even collected masks and sculpture imported from France's colonies in West and Central Africa, sometimes directly translating their forms into his own compositions. He did so while maintaining for his entire life that he had never seen such works at the time of his first Cubist experiments. Picasso and Paper features a gallery that traces the evolution of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, providing a rare opportunity to see the many changes and variations that Picasso considered along the way to its completion in 1907. Pages from several of the 16 sketchbooks that he filled while creating the painting reveal that the composition that we know so well today actually transformed completely during its creation. Throughout these sketches, we can see that Picasso originally conceived of 2 men alongside the women, so that those subjects interacted with the sex workers before ultimately deciding to turn the woman's gaze outward to the viewer. In addition to these studies, numerous works on paper from around the time of Demoiselles d'Avignon's creation focus closely on individual figures. And this reveals that even as he was creating one of the most revolutionary paintings in the history of art, Picasso was still following a fundamentally traditional process that involved laying out every aspect of his composition before painting. He was also constantly rethinking and reconsidering the work from every possible angle as he went. After Picasso completed Demoiselles d'Avignon, he showed it to close friends and colleagues who were collectively shocked and repulsed. One of his friends famously described seeing the painting for the first time as being comparable to the experience of drinking gasoline. Not high praise. For that reason, Picasso kept it in his studio and didn't show it publicly for nearly a decade. In the meantime, he reached an impasse as he considered what to do next and returned to his sources of inspiration. He especially focused on his continued interest in art from West and Central Africa at this time, as we can see in this study of a small sculpture. Around the time of its creation, Picasso had visited an exhibition of such 3-dimensional works at Paris's Ethnographic Museum, and it was a major influence from which he sometimes appropriated very directly. Picasso's experiments with Demoiselles d'Avignon led him to the development of Cubism in collaboration with artist Georges Braque, and Picasso on Paper traces the important role that paper played in that transformation. In these early Cubist drawings, offering a bust view of Fernande Olivier, we can see Picasso considering the question of perspective and integrating multiple vantage points into a single work. Sketching and then fragmenting his subject on paper allowed him to transition from a recognizable subject to complete abstraction, as in the works here. In doing so, Picasso drew very directly from the post-impressionist artist Paul Cézanne, who had, in the decades just before, worked to transform recognizable and timeless subjects. So for him, this is things like landscape, portraiture, and still life. And he did this using fragmented hinging geometric planes. And in doing so, Cezanne initiated questions about vision and perception, so the way that we see things, that Picasso then sought to advance further in his own work. With Georges Braque, Picasso avidly took up this project over a concentrated period of time and in numerous media. These three works each show him exploring the dissolution of a guitar into geometric planes. Early on, he more straightforwardly broke down his subject into squares and included visual cues, so things like letters, music, notes, parts of a guitar, in a phase that is known art historically as analytic cubism. Later, in a phase called synthetic cubism, he gathered geometric shapes together so that they cumulatively created a recognizable subject, often through the use of collage. As seen here, in some instances, he went so far as to construct a guitar from paper and cardboard. Picasso and Braque called this distinctive collage technique papier-collé, or pasted papers. They saw it as a means of suggesting space, but also of replacing typical forms of representation, like drawn lines, with fragmentary signs and symbols. Picasso used paper ephemera of all kinds for these works, including things like wallpaper, newspaper, invitations, and tickets, so anything that he had on hand. Musical instruments were a frequent subject for him and one that he saw as a stand-in for the female body. Ultimately, he hoped that papier-collé would serve as a statement against the strictures and limitations of high art for its interplay with everyday life and modernity. Alongside these experiments, Picasso also briefly became involved with theater and ballet around this time. In 1917, he collaborated on a performance of Parade, a ballet written by Jean Cocteau with music by Eric Satie. The ballet was led by Serge Diaghilev and his avant-garde troupe, the Ballet Russe. Diaghilev commissioned Picasso to design sets, costumes, a stage curtain, and makeup for the staging of a narrative about the failed attempts of three managers to attract audiences to their respective performers. So this is kind of like a metaphor of sorts for the struggle of avant-garde artists at the time trying to find an audience for their own work. With a musical score featuring an unusual combination of typewriters, sirens, and airplane propellers, the ballet appealed to Picasso's interest in challenging the boundaries of high art. And the image that you're seeing on the screen is actually an exceptional loan to the exhibition from the Paris Opera. And this is one of the costumes that Picasso designed for Parade. It's the second iteration of the costume. It was redesigned in the 1970s, and this is the one that they would use today for if they staged a performance of the ballet. But I was speaking with them while installing the work. They shared that, unsurprisingly, this is one of their dancers' least favorite costumes because, as you can probably imagine from looking at it, it doesn't really breathe. A body of work that I especially enjoy from Picasso and Paper features works on paper that Picasso created during the First World War. In an unexpected turn from his Cubist experiments around 1914, Picasso started to work in a neoclassical style known for its very spare sense of linearity. This shift has been seen as a response to the chaos of war and its new sobriety and restraint, and it defined Picasso's work for about a decade that followed. He especially favored portraiture, including these examples showing his then wife, Olga Koklova, a Russian ballet performer who is a member of the Ballet Russe, and the Impressionist painter Auguste Renoir. For each, he began by drawing in graphite, sometimes from a photograph. He would then erase the graphite drawing and basically trace his own drawing, reinforce the line with a charcoal pencil to create this incredibly flawless, confident, and precise line we see in drawings. In doing so, he drew inspiration from the renowned 19th century French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and his series of intimate portraits, which similarly depicted his social circle using a detailed, veristic style. Ingres was an artist who Picasso admired deeply, so this series formed a tribute of sorts, but also a way for Picasso, as an artist who was always, always, always thinking about his legacy, to establish his own place within the art historical canon. Around the same time, Picasso traveled throughout Italy, including Rome, Naples, Pompeii, and Florence, and he started to make works that were more directly inspired by antiquity. This was his most concentrated period of studying classical art, and he was struck most of all by its mass and permanence. In drawings like The Spring, he approximated the visual style of Roman art, but also exaggerated its forms and scale to create a sense of monumentality. And I especially like this drawing because of its size. You can the centimeters might not immediately give you a clear idea of its scale, but it is enormous. And I really love the unusual technique. And so to create the work, Picasso is working on a canvas that's prepared for painting, and he's drawing using a greasy crayon that's used for the printmaking technique of lithography. So nothing he's using here is a traditional drawing technique, but he always kind of wanted to see what he could do with any material that was available to him, and I feel like that really comes through in this particular work. During the 1920s, Picasso found himself increasingly attracted to Surrealism, a movement that considered the role of dreams and the unconscious in art making, completely rejecting rational thought. This was, of course, yet another dramatic shift, this time from the clean rationality of his neoclassical period. It was also a shift that might be less familiar to some, since Picasso isn't an artist typically associated with Surrealism. His connection to the movement was due in part to his developing romantic relationship, I should add, with Dora Maar. She was an influential and accomplished surrealist photographer who you're seeing him with in this photograph. By 1925, the surrealist leader, a poet named André Breton, declared of Picasso that, quote, "We proudly claim him as one of us." Members of the group saw him as a kind of hero for the fact that, in his own words, he painted subjects as he thought them, not as he saw them. In 1926, he exhibited a series of guitars incorporating elements like newspaper and cardboard in an important surrealist group show. Their uncanny combination of materials, such as here you're seeing strings that can't be plucked and sharp nails that strongly discourage playing, align directly with the irrationality of surrealist ideology. During this period, Picasso also began a secret relationship with Marie-Thérèse Walter, a much younger woman. She was 17 and a half to his mid-40s, who he met while strolling through Paris. She soon became a constant subject for his art, appearing as the subject of actual portraits, but also works that more obliquely explore the trope of the artist and his model. Here, the two figures are barely recognizable in a composition that combines cubist abstraction with the irrationality of surrealism. Despite its large scale and finish, we can see along the unfinished margin that drawing, and therefore paper, was still at the core of Picasso's practice. Picasso was resistant to the idea of political art throughout his long career, but he was deeply affected by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, a conflict between leftist Republicans and the fascist Nationalist Party in 1936, and soon after also by the Second World War. Partly influenced by the anti-war activism of Dora Maar, who was still his romantic partner, he began to create openly anti-war prints, such as The Dream and Lie of Franco, that drew on the long history of this medium as a means of social critique. The Dream and Lie of Franco was originally conceived as a series of postcards to raise funds for the Republican cause, leading Picasso to the unusual squared format that you're seeing here. Its individual images satirize nationalist leader Francisco Franco, his rise to power, and his claim to represent Spanish culture, presenting him as absurd and destructive to Spain and to its culture. Picasso planned for the printed postcards to be sold to raise funds for Spanish Republicans at the country's pavilion in the 1937 World's Fair, but this seems ultimately not to have happened. All of the prints are still, that we know of, are still intact, haven't been cut up. Their works in the gallery devoted to the war years explore the development of one of Picasso's very best known paintings, Guernica. Universally recognized as one of history's most pointed anti-war images, the canvas depicted the tragic bombing of a public market in a Basque village by the German National Socialists and Italian fascists, leading to mass civilian casualties, mostly women and children. Drawings for this iconic painting reveal that, as always, Picasso experimented relentlessly with the composition before ever beginning work on it. The study of a horse located at the painting's center, for example, tells us that at one point Picasso considered making the work using bright, vivid tones to create an impact before settling on its distinctive monochromatic palette of grades, black and white. While creating such works, which commented on universal experience, he also explored his personal life and others, such as women in their toilette, one of his most monumental works on paper. It is worth noting that the exhibition of this work in Picasso and Paper is actually the first time it has ever been exhibited in the United States. And this view gives you a sense of some of the reasons why. It is a very, very large work, very difficult to travel. To create it, Picasso cut and layered a wide variety of paper materials, working especially with a variety of wallpapers. He pasted them onto a paper support, making additions in paint to create this massive image of the three women in his life at the time. His younger partner of a decade, Marie-Thérèse Walter, his romantic partner, the surrealist photographer Dora Maar, and his estranged wife, Olga Koklova. The work was originally commissioned from the artist as a design for a tapestry, but Picasso kept it in his studio instead, and as a result, the final work was only created in the 1970s. During the war, Picasso briefly fled Paris for the rural French coast, and this period also saw him making some of his most experimental works with paper, given his remote locale and the limitations on available materials. Here you're seeing one of numerous examples of torn paper shapes that he created from materials on hand, such as napkins and tablecloths for his friends and family as a means of entertainment and formal experimentation during a particularly challenging time. The end of World War II brought about another return to order in Picasso's art, this time through tradition. Late in life, during the 1950s and 60s, Picasso produced a body of work in which he considered two iconic paintings from French modern art history: the 19th century Romantic painter Eugène Delacroix's Women of Algiers, and Impressionist Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. Here you're seeing the wide range of prints and drawings and paintings that he created on Women of Algiers. And his series on this work ultimately included 15 paintings, including the Wadsworth Athenaeums, which is the second in the series, 100 drawings, and many more prints. Delacroix's 1834 canvas was groundbreaking in its time for the artist's use of bold color and for his depiction of a subject, 4 women in a private apartment, that would have been inaccessible to male European artists at the time. Its provocative subject matter was further enhanced by the direct gaze between the woman at left and the viewer, a device that Picasso surely kept in mind when he had created Demoiselle d'Avignon. He studied the painting weekly at Paris's Musée du Louvre, and when asked by a friend how he felt about Delacroix, he responded characteristically, quote, "That bastard, he's really good." And here we're seeing a selection of the many works he created after Manet. Both Delacroix and Manet were recognized within the canon for changing the course of modern art through their transformative subject matter and formal experimentation. By aligning himself with their work, therefore, Picasso was clearly trying to articulate his place within a broader art historical lineage and thinking very pointedly about his own legacy. One of the final galleries of Picasso and Paper offers an expansive view on Picasso's chosen materials and techniques, which often push the limits of established practice. This particular space creates an opportunity that I especially love to consider Picasso's collaborative relationships with some of the women who are more frequently portrayed as his models and lovers. Françoise Gillot, for example, was depicted by Picasso numerous times, but was also an incredibly talented artist in her own right, and the two had a symbiotic creative relationship. In the gallery, we see Picasso and Gillot considering the same subject on 2 occasions. So here they're both, he's creating a portrait of her, she's creating a self-portrait. This allows visitors to see the ways in which they actually drew inspiration from each other. The gallery also features some really wonderfully experimental and unexpectedly playful works, like this lithograph of Picasso's children, Paloma and Claude, which the artist created from his own fingerprints. To depict Paloma, he drew his finger across the lithographic stone in ink, and to show Claude, he accumulated dense layers of fingerprints that collectively add up to the young boy's face. Likewise, a series of lithographs thought to depict Françoise Gillot and Dora Maar demonstrates Picasso's unusually experimental approach to printmaking techniques. The 4 images you see here are from a series of 10, in which he edited a drawing created on a lithographic stone, which was an incredibly laborious process that involved carving off the stone's surface and redrawing so that it transformed from a realistic depiction into one that was defined by Cubist abstraction. And finally, in this gallery, I just want to mention what I think is a kind of a wonderful little section. This case shows how Picasso used virtually any piece of paper available to him. He held on to absolutely everything, which was something that kind of came as a surprise to me when I was working on the exhibition. He kept every piece of paper that came in and out of his life, kept it piled up in his studio. And then when he ran out of room, he started to bundle papers and hang them from the ceiling. And you're seeing an image of that on the screen now, some of his paper bundles. So the case in this image includes some of the more fun and playful examples of this habit from his personal archives. So things like letters he wrote and drew on before sending them, envelopes from bills that he got in the mail that he would draw on instead of throwing them away. Paper sample books where he could flip through and decide, see all of the options that he had available to him of different types of paper. And even at the far right, the three-dimensional object is actually a paper mache sculpture of a crumpled ball of paper. So he kept literally everything. In 1961, following a major surgery that made him begin to more seriously consider his own mortality, Picasso moved to the south of France, where he set up what would become his final studio. There, paper remained central to his working process, and he used it for both sketches, but also for finished works, like this carefully considered portrait of his wife, Jacqueline Roque, made from a folded and cut sheet. Picasso met Roque during her work as a salesperson at the studio where he made ceramics. They became romantically involved, but she also became essential to his productivity and helped with administrative tasks to ensure that he could remain as productive as possible during what would become his final years. To make prints, for instance, Picasso would work on multiple plates at the same time, giving them to Roque for her annotations before she would then transport them to his printer, wait for them to be printed, and return them with revisions for Picasso to consider so that he could keep working on multiple compositions at the same time without interruption. So you're seeing the two of them together here in this photograph from their apartment in his last studio with their dachshund, who is named Lump. During this last decade, Picasso collaborated closely with two master printers, Aldo and Piero Cromlink. With them, he established a print shop at his villa in 1963, allowing him to work essentially as he pleased. During this focus period, he produced about 750 prints. This is an incredible number of prints. If you've never made prints yourself, it's a truly enormous number of prints in a brief period of time. And this reflects the incredibly intense and nearly unprecedented productivity of his life at this time. In this late print from his suite 347, which is named for the number of prints that it contained, you can see Picasso meditating on his own reputation. So he's presenting himself before an anonymous but staring crowd and the subject of his work from earlier in his career. So he'd done many images of circus performers. In this seemingly straightforward portrait, he revisits his own work, but he also meditates on the struggles of the creative process and reputation creation. And these are two prevailing concerns that recur throughout his life, but most clearly throughout his use of paper over the course of nearly a century. Well, thank you. I am happy to take questions.
Congratulations, Britany. This is marvelous. This is such a wonderful show. And I will have to come to Cleveland to see it.
Please do. We love visitors.
Such a rich and wonderful overview about his life, about his activities, about his engagement with all kinds of different paper.
Yeah.
I thought I knew already nearby everything about the artist.
I feel like that's one of the great things about the show is that you can go into it not knowing anything about Picasso, or you can go into it being kind of like an expert in his work and still come out with something, having learned something new. It was always nice.
And I had exactly that feeling when I saw just a few years ago a show at MoMA in New York about Picasso as sculptor. I think that was about 2017, 2018. And I
Yeah.
now feel that your show in Cleveland with Picasso and paper is just very, very similar.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I do have a question, Brittany, and I want to kick these questions perhaps off with this first question. Very just basically, did your thinking change during the course of your work on the show about Picasso as draftsman? Were there some revelations that you had along the way?
Yeah, so I mean, the things that were kind of surprising to me were that no matter where you looked in his career, you could always see the influence that his traditional training had on him. Even when the work itself didn't look conservative or traditional, even when it was incredibly experimental and avant-garde, you could always see that he kept what he had learned from his father. Even though he had a complicated relationship with his father, he always kept it, and it was always in the back of his head, and it always kind of determined or guided the artistic choices that he made. And so that kind of surprised me in thinking about him. But the other thing that really surprised me, and especially seeing all the works in the exhibition together, was that he really had a playful side. I mean, we think of him as, as kind of serious intellectual artist, um, and sometimes, for his issues of women, things like that. I mean, he's associated with a lot of like big, serious, heavy ideas, but he was very playful in his work, and he had a lot of fun with his art making practice. And I think paper was especially kind of a low stakes place for him to just kind of play around. And so I felt like, seeing the works together and reading more about his use of paper really kind of allowed me to rethink his work in a couple of different ways and in surprising ways.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
of
will
course.
I will now ask you the first question from our audience, and it is about women and about his representations of women. And the question is Picasso's work, particularly his work depicting the women or models in his life, is that exploitative?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I don't know, like exploitative, like, probably. I don't think anyone would argue that Picasso was a good guy. And especially I think in recent years there's been more and more more attention in both scholarship and in the popular discourse on just how problematic his relationships were with women. And while the exhibition has been on view here in Cleveland, we had a really wonderful writer named Claire Detter come and give a talk. And she wrote this popular nonfiction book, which won a lot of awards last year, called Monsters. And the kind of central question of the book is, what do we do with the art of great men? We really love the work. The art itself is amazing, but the people who make it are really problematic. And so that was really helpful, I think, both for me and for visitors to the exhibition, and kind of thinking about the questions to ask yourself when we're looking at this material. Um, for my like for me personally, one of the ways that I tried to work through those issues in this exhibition was by including works by the women in his life, many of whom are are thought of just as lovers and models. There's hundreds of works with Marie Therese in the title, or Fernand. And Fernand Olivier was actually an artist too. She, her work is completely lost to art history. And so in the exhibition, we've included, photographs by Dora Maar. Fernand Olivier published a book that she illustrated with about her time with Picasso, and so that's included in the exhibition. There's several works by Francois Gillot, and so just trying to show and draw more attention to the fact that Picasso was a fundamentally collaborative person, and he was depicting these women, but he was also kind of working with them. They were working out creative ideas side by side and often together, and their work often during the time they were together closely resembled one another, and it was a relationship that went in both directions. He wasn't just influencing them, or they were influencing his work also. And so I hope that fact is clear through some of the comparisons of artworks throughout the gallery.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I do have another question,
Yeah.
which goes into a completely different direction now. So, given the fragility of paper, how have these pieces been preserved?
So the kind of underlying rule with any paper, even like the least fragile paper, is that light damages paper over time. And so the best thing you could do to preserve any work of art on paper, including Picasso's, is to keep it in the dark and don't put it on view. And so the Picasso Museum and many other, I mean, any other museum for the most part, has strict policies about the exposure of these works of art over time. So one of the great benefits of the fact that, we had this incredibly extended timeline with our exhibition was that we could kind of, set aside this body of work that we wanted to be able to include and make sure that it wasn't, no one else tried to get it for their exhibition. So we got, the general rule for works on paper is for every 3 months that something is on view, which is kind of a standard length of time for an exhibition, a work needs to rest, like stay in the dark in storage for 5 years. And so we were able to kind of set aside the works that we wanted for the show. There were some works in the exhibition. There's a group of works that relate to to a movie that Picasso participated in during the 1950s. They're drawings that he made using cheap newsprint paper and felt tip markers. So like felt tip markers had just were a relatively new invention in the 50s. And so he's drawing with them for the first time on this newsprint. Newsprint is like probably the lowest quality paper. Felt tip markers probably have like the worst color, the worst quality ink in terms of how the color fades over time. And so we really wanted to be able to include those works in the exhibition. And so though to be able to do that, the Picasso Museum was able to conserve them and treat them and work, do as much as they were able to bring them back to their original experience because they developed conservation issues over time. But it's just kind of a question of balancing the time on view versus the time resting. So after the exhibition, they will go and rest for many years again. This is your one chance to see them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As the last question, I would like to ask you the following one. Picasso was so experimental. Did he ever combine paper with his ceramics?
Well, that's such a good question. His ceramics, I am actually not sure. He definitely worked on ceramics alongside paper prints, especially like prints. They were, he made at the end of his life, he worked very extensively in ceramics and in prints. Those were kind of like the things that he did the most. I don't know of a work in which he combined the two. I mean, the closest thing I can think of from the exhibition is like the paper mache sculpture, which kind of has the plaster and the paper. It wasn't something that I came across in the course of research for the exhibition, but now I really wonder, and I will definitely look into it and see if I can find anything. But there isn't like a single like famous example that I know of him doing that.
Britany, thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
This was a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for every one of you for joining us here for this wonderful talk. And I was just told by Diana, who reminded me to tell you that every one of you will get a recording of this session, so no worries. And you will also hear very soon from us about our next Artful Conversations. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you very much, Britany, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.